to everyone. Welcome to Wisdom, Pattern, Order, Disorder, and Reorder. This is your Pastor Yadi. Today I'm going to talk about transformation, part 1. I hope you enjoy this in-depth insight in this wisdom pattern. We would think that the unexpected brings the most stress to our lives. But psychologists say that planned change is even more disruptive than unplanned change. Somehow things that just happen are seen as acts of God. We can fight them, ignore them, or accept them. But we know we can't fix them or change them. So, after the initial shock or disappointment, we have and we find the energy to deal with them. We find the grace to rise to the occasion. But when we think there's some malicious or lesser might at work, or that we could have changed something by wile or guile, we fight it, fret over it, and never stop fussing, at least internally. That's stress. For the past 50 years, we've been experts at planning change. That is a phenomenon for the most part. Unfortunately, it has now become a mindset and a way of life. We think we can do it and that we might ought to be doing it. That's not to say that some of the changes we've brought about in church and society weren't good and necessary, but I think we have paid a large price internally for such a Promethean, daringly original self-image. For the most part, we can no longer yet let it be. We are now natural fixers, changers, adjusters, constant engineers of our own reality. It makes for a very different kind of soul. It develops what I call the calculative or calculative mind, as opposed to the goal of all mature spirituality, the contemplative mind. The attitude that is needed for deep and panoramic seeing is not a fixing, calculating stance, but much more an attitude of listening, trusting, and waiting. It is the only way to get out of the way with our judgment, control, mechanisms, and personal opinions. And maybe that's why Jesus says we are saved by faith, by trusting and surrendering instead of pushing and trying, and by passion, the suffering of reality. Rather than deliberate action. Interestingly, we say we are saved by the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. All things that are done to him more than anything he does. It seems that the human person needs an absolute outside of itself. Have you noticed how much the enthusiastic types on television or radio use the word absolutely, even when they're talking about an exercise machine? in an age when we have no real absolute. The whirling mind and emotions look for something upon which to settle in order to take away their anxiety. We seem to need an outer reference point to stop the vertigo of our own imaginations and the tyranny of having to make constant choices. We seem to need some kind of God to serve as a centerpiece. I will create an absolute for myself to justify and settle my choices. My football team, my marriage, my religion, my land, my theory, my self-image, my rights, my exercise machine, anything at all. Just give me something to wrap my thoughts and feelings around for a while. Something outside of myself. An idea, an event, a person, a project, to free me from the boredom and tyranny of myself. It works and gives us a settled sense of purpose and direction. Without it, we find it very hard to live with our own minds and emotions. The idea is not wrong, just misplaced. The only real issue is to find an absolute that really has some absolute character to it. And that is probably the difference between a wise person and a morally opinionated or driven person. Wisdom knows what is worth worshipping and honoring. And the rest of us will settle for anything to get us through the next conversation. I believe that everybody has faith in something in order to survive, even if it is faith in cynicism. We all find something upon which to lean and false gods to work for short periods. We all find some absolute around which to whirl, even if it is an absolute opinion that there is no God. I use the concepts of faith and the contemplative mind almost interchangeable. For me, they are the same reality, both describing the trustful and God-centered way that we can allow ourselves to be used. In this different mind, we do not so much try to change reality or others, as allow ourselves to be changed, so that we can be usable for God. It is not so important what we do now as the who that is doing it. This is crucial, and it is at the heart of what we mean by that amorphous word holiness. There is a radically transformed experience of the when we are holy, both within ourselves and noticed by those who observe us. The private I has been transformed into a larger self that believers would call God. I live no longer, not I. See for that scripture verse in Galatians 2, verse 20. The belly of the whale. The word change normally refers to the new beginnings. But transformation, the mystery we're examining more often, happens not when something new begins, but when something old falls apart. The pain of something old falling apart, chaos, invites the soul to listen at a deeper level. It invites and sometimes forces the soul to go to a new place because the old place is falling apart. Most of us would never go to new places in any other way. The mystics use many words to describe this chaos: fire, dark night, death, emptiness, abandonment, trial, the evil one. Whatever it is, it does not feel good, and it does not feel like God. We will do anything to keep the old things from falling apart. This is when we need patience and guidance and the freedom to let go, instead of tightening our controls and certitudes. Perhaps Jesus is describing just this phenomenon when he says, "It is a narrow gate and a hard road that leads to life, and only a few find it." Matthew 7:13-14. Not accidentally, he mentions this narrow road right after teaching the Golden Rule. He knows how much letting go it takes to treat others as you would like them to treat you. That is in Matthew 7:12. So a change can force a transformation. Spiritual transformation always includes a usually disconcerting reorientation. It can either help people to find a new meaning, or it can force people to close down and slowly turn bitter. The difference is determined precisely by the quality of our inner life, our spirituality. Change happens, but transformation is always a process of letting go, living in the confusing, shadowy space for a while, and eventually being spit up on a new and unexpected shore. We can see why Jonah in the belly of the whale is such an important symbol for many Jews and Christians. In moments of insecurity and crisis, shoulds and oughts don't really help. They just increase the shame, the guilt, the pressure, and likelihood of backslides. It's the deeper yes as that carry us through. It's that deeper something we are strongly for that allows us to wait it out. It's someone in whom we absolutely believe and to whom we commit. In plain language, love wins out over guilt any day. It is said that we settle for the short-run effectiveness of shaming people instead of the long-term life benefits of true transformation. But then, we are a culture of product and efficiency, not terribly patient with growth. God clearly is much more patient, and finally, much more effective. God lets Jonah run in the wrong direction, but finds a long-suffering, circuitous path to get him back where he needs to be, in spite of himself, that is patiently supporting inner transformation. Only God seems to have developed such a talent. We usually prefer order, control, predictability, and immediacy. I think that is probably the most striking difference between institutional religion and the God of mercy. The loss of criteria. The previous personal theistic worldview saw things in terms of what was often called the great chain of being. The great monotheistic religions held God as a clear other reference point that grounded and originated all things. All lower things were understood in terms of the higher, which gave them an essential importance in the universe. Everything belonged and mirrored the highest. Within the great chain of being, which I will explore in more detail further on, everything was intrinsically connected and had inherent dignity and meaning. The order was typically first the divine realm, second the realm of angels and heaven, third the human, fourth the animals, fifth the vegetable, sixth the waters and minerals in the earth, and seven the earth itself, which held them all together. They were all linked in purpose, meaning, and sacredness. Some contemporary metaphors for the same are the seamless garment, a cosmic ego, to be examined further on. Spiritual ecology and the integrity of all creation, as long as there is a transcendent reference point, an outer sacred source which communicates itself. Then there is inherent and pervasive meaning in all the other links in the chain. It's an enchanted and coherent universe, inside of which almost all people have lived since the beginning of human history. Nothing is profound once we have learned how to see. We are the sad exceptions, living in dualistic and finally scattered universe, which is no longer a universe, that which turns around one at all. Almost all people who have lived on the planet were absolutely certain about the highest and therefore moved downward and outward with clarity and noble assurance. This certainty created an objective criterion and reference point for naming the good, the true and the beautiful. Thus, St. Francis could even see the divine image in a worm. If there is a creator, then everything else is a creature and, in part, reflects the divine image. Either we see God in everything, or we have lost the basis for seeing God in anything. Once the dualistic mind takes over, the ego is in a pick, choose, and decide game, which is the beginning of exclusionary, punishing, and even violent religion. Remember, anthropologically, religions begins with the making of a distinction between the pure and the impure. Jesus consistently ignores such a distinction. In fact, it is at the heart of almost half of his gospel actions. For postmodernism, on the other hand, everything is relative or relative. That, of course, is ultimately indefensible, because if everything is relative, then that principle is relative too. Because the contemporary mind has decided that everything is relative instead of relational, a theistic or personalized universe. It forces the individual to manufacture, make by hand, his or her own greatness. Perhaps we have confused relative with relational. Relative thinking allows us to dismiss or decrease the energy in everything. Relational thinking allows us to increase the energy and kneel in awe before God in all things. I call the first depreciators and the second appreciators. If God is not the center, we are burdened with being the counter ourselves. What an impossible and self-defeating task. Moment by moment, I am at the whim of whimsical desire. What do, want, or am I important now? Become wrong first questions and keep us trapped in pettiness. Secular people are burdened with finding their own meaning and their private significance by themselves. It's an impossible and self-defeating task without the inherent dignity that comes from whom we are in God. We have to become more and more outrageous, more and more bizarre, more and more exaggerated or isolated to make sure that we stand out amid billions of people. The eccentric is the one who lives outside the center. We expect this of a young person who is still finding his or her center, but now meaning in their 80s still live with such fragile or over-padded egos. We are no longer living in a wisdom culture when even age does not lead to foundations and ground. Postmodernism ends up with what some call reductionism. We can no longer start from the top and find universal meaning reflecting through all of creation. Everything is disconnected, standing on its own, unable to validate itself apart from itself. Everything is diminished and demystified. So, the best we can normally do is take the lowest level that we can control and understand and move up from there. If we can move up at all, the language of the reductionist often begins with only or just, with suspicion and cynicism. This language will determine ahead of time how much we can see. The reductionist and suspicious mind is trapped in a world where it can always be in charge, which is only at the smallest level and with the most insecure self. Our own tiny moment of history, our limited individual capacity to understand. Nothing great comes from reductionism or suspicious minds, except to initially clear away the bogus issues. Faith, instead, is the exact opposite. Faith, in its most universal sense, is openness to magnanimity. mystery, and so much more. We do not have to be religious to know that is true. Postmodernism has tried to overcome the emptiness or nihilism of modernism by refusing to commit itself to any worldview. It could be called a movable famine and has no comparable precedent in all of human history. Admittedly, modernism's technological, scientific explanation of everything did not feed the soul. It was and is empty of deep meaning. So, rather than not be fed, we moved one step further into famine by refusing to be committed to any sustaining food. Skepticism is another way to avoid ever having to place or bet, and therefore ever getting hurt. Universal skepticism is a common thought process today. Critical thinking often looks like intelligence and sometimes is. Skepticism and criticism are fail-safe protection measures for the psyche. But when they dominate, something deeper and more important has been decided. The human qualities of difference, patience, humility, risk-taking, and social grace are also needed for culture and its consonance. Humans grow in such a garden. Jesus does not encourage or expect a world where people are never hurt or never suffer guilt or injustice. His entire concern is what we do with mistakes when they happen, always knowing that they will. Forgiving 70 times 7, Matthew 18:22, is a medicine for a healing community, not for a community with all the answers beforehand and all the appropriated punishments afterwards. After you've loved and failed a few times, you become afraid to love again. After you have suffered, as the world has suffered through the hundreds of millions humans killed in war in the 20th century, you are sure to create ways to protect yourself so that you would not have to suffer again. Postmodernism is a way out. No commitments, no surrenders, no absolute anything, no passion for anything, and therefore no disappointment, no hurt. On a certain level, it makes sense. But through the lessons of the crucified, we are learning a different way. We can't avoid persecution. In fact, our assumption is that Jesus' lifestyle will probably lead to some new forms of persecutions. When we give ourselves to the mystery of Christ, we give ourselves to being hurt, to being on the wheel of life, to walking what we call the way of the cross. And no wonder so much of the world resists it. We want to be on that wheel. Who wants that? Who wants to enter into solidarity with the tragic mystery of things? Who wants to be formed by the left hand of God? Who wants to bear the suffering? Few, I would think. Only those who have been led through the mystery of death and resurrection and come out larger and awake. That's probably what the tradition means by those oft misunderstood words, chosenness or election. In that sense, I say Christianity was intended by Jesus to be a minority position and always will be. He wasn't dividing the world into those God loved and those God didn't love. Jesus was creating a remnant who were usable by God to keep the whole world from its violent path towards self-destruction. Jesus was loving and drawing all of us into God. Or, as John put it, to gather together into one the scattered children of God. John 11:52. That is very different than forming a new tribe of saved and superior people. All I see Jesus talking about is being light, being yeast, being salt, and being mustard seed. This is rather prominent both at the beginning of his inaugural address, Matthew 5:13-16, and in his parabolic discourse, Luke 13:18-21. It's hard to believe that we missed it in favor of visions of Christendom, moral majorities, general institutions, electorates, and your excellencies. It keeps us in the imperial ego mind, as opposed to the surrendered, trusting mind of Jesus. It seems that, in earthly terms, all Jesus ever intended was yeast of truth that would be a change agent or leavener in history. Ironically, Jesus and his disciples looked much more like an immoral minority than any moral majority. His plan was truly subversive, and it is the only one that ever has a change of true victory. So I will stop here. We move on with the second part of the transformation. So it's quite a bit, right? But it's very interesting and very thoughtful, at least if you want to be open to all this. Excuse me. So may the Spirit guide you when you go through this, and use it for your own personal life to give you a journey, a new meaning, and maybe others who walks with you. God's blessings. This is your Pastor Yeti. Bye-bye.